Chapter 10. When you returned to your city, what happened? Captain Cortez has explained that you became hostile and that he was forced to punish your people. That is not precise because we did not fight him, at least not in the beginning. What happened is that we tried to live on as we had before that encounter. People went to the marketplace, they ate and dressed and complained and gossiped, trying to pretend nothing had happened. But it was all a lie because we had reached our last day and we knew it. What was left of our society after that first meeting between Moctezuma and Captain Cortez was a dream, and we were the dreamwalkers. We deluded ourselves into believing that our lives would continue as before, that nothing had changed. Everyone hoped that all would be well, but we were foolish because we perished the moment our king surrendered his throne on the day I have just described. Now I know that the procession that went out to greet your captains in Itzapalapa was really a funeral cortege. Father Benito, anxious to fill in details of what happened during the time after the encounter, pressed Huitzilin. We have been told that our men came in peace, but that the Mexicans responded in bad faith, that you instead attacked slyly and in treachery. No, what a lie! That is not what happened. The woman's voice rose shrilly, her voice slurred against toothless gums, and her hands clutched the armrest of the chair. It is true that we fought back almost as soon as they arrived, but it was a struggle that happened without arms. When the king opened the gates of the city to your soldiers, treating them as if they had indeed been gods, we tried to follow his example. But soon those men began to act as if our palaces, courtyards, and marketplaces were their own to do with as they pleased. It became clear that they thought that all they had to do was to stretch out a hand and there would be food or drink. They also took an intense liking to our women. We discovered almost immediately that we could no longer walk from one chamber to another without hearing a vile sound or seeing a lustful look. Our king, nevertheless, urged us to endure that humiliation, and we obeyed even though we didn't understand the reason. This went on for months before we attacked your forces, making them run and drown in the lake. The priest stopped writing. I thought that hostilities had begun immediately. No, months passed before the battle for Tenochtitlan took place. It was then that I first became aware of him, because I felt his eyes constantly on me. He was one of the captains closest to Captain Cortez. His name was Baltazar Ovando. Father Benito, eyebrows lifted in curiosity, cocked his head. Captain Ovando? Who was he? I don't recall reading or hearing about him. The woman did not avoid the monk's inquisitive gaze, but instead returned it. Her expression was frank. He became my lover. The priest dropped the quill and reached for the stole, preparing himself for the confession he was sure to hear. He was becoming accustomed to Huitzilin's unpredictable turns. Suddenly she blocked his hand in mid-air. No, priest, not yet. I'll tell you when the time comes for you to hear the rest of my sins. In the meantime, let me speak of him a little, and then I'll continue with the details of those months previous to the death and bloodshed that led to where we are now. At that time, I had no way of knowing whether he was handsome or not, because they all looked ugly to me. Later on, however, I grew to distinguish them, and I began to see that his teeth were not rotted like those of the others, and that he did not smell as much. He was young, no more than 5 years older than I. At first I avoided his persistent gaze, but his eyes began to entice me, luring and inviting me. I recall that he, unlike the rest of the white men, did not force himself upon me. He simply looked at me, and when finally I looked in return, I saw the gentle smile that I had seen only in Zintel's gaze. The white man's eyes were more amazed to me because they were the color of the lake's water when the sky was blue. I noticed also that his skin was the color of a white feather, and that his hair was golden like the color of maize. Father Benito's imagination was captivated by what the woman was saying, and he wanted to hear more. He had not expected the events of those days to be intertwined with her life, but now that she had begun to take that direction, he decided to ask her to continue. What about your child? And Zintel? Did Captain Ovando know about them? Huitzilopochtli sucked her lips. The sound expressed exasperation. I'll speak more of those matters later on. In the meantime, let me finish telling you what happened up until the fall of our city. Benito felt that sting of embarrassment, knowing that she had noticed he was prying. He despondently returned to recording her words. Moctezuma did everything in his power to please the white men. He housed them in the late father's palace. He continued to shower them with gifts. He visited them, and even appeared to like Captain Cortez. When he had a small boat built on our lake, the king actually boarded it. They spent hours playing games of chance or engaged in conversation. Malinche was always present because she was by that time Cortez's concubine. However, a truce among gods is always a short one, and so the false peace that prevailed between the captain and our king those first months broke like a fragile mirror. The pretended courtesy that marked our first encounters began to fray. Our nobles and warriors resented the ways in which your captains placed their crosses anywhere possible. We hated how our shrines were being desecrated with the presence of the lady dressed in blue, the one whose face looked small and pinched. Your monks, who were no cleaner than ours, harassed and intimidated our own priests as they arrogantly strutted in their long brown robes, dragging and rattling their wooden beads. Father Benito stopped writing and pointed the quill at Huitzilopochtli. His hand was shaking. I shall not let you speak blasphemously about our blessed mother, nor should you slander the brave missionaries who have sacrificed their lives to bring your people salvation. If you continue to do so, Senora, I will leave. This time Huitzilopochtli had gone too far, and the monk's lip quivered as he struggled with the outrage of listening to the woman as she maligned what was sacred to him. But despite his rancor, she seemed oblivious to what he had said. Horses and dogs defiled our courtyards, and weapons that were dragged on wheels gutted our paving. Never before had Tenochtitlan seen so much waste cast in every direction. Animal bones, unpalatable even to dogs, were strewn over the ground. Soiled clothing, tattered foot coverings, cast-off leather, damaged and no longer useful utensils, all littered our once beautiful squares and gardens. We loathed the presence of your people and could not understand why Moctezuma did not put an end to it. But what most revolted us was the presence of the hateful Tlaxcaltecas, they of the rancid bread, they who aspired to our grandeur. The Tlaxcaltecas were the greatest traitors of them all. You ask when the real hostilities began? I'll tell you. The false truth unraveled when Captain Cortez accompanied Moctezuma to the temple of Huitzilopochtli. He demanded that the altar be wiped clean of the sacred blood that encrusted it, and that a cross as well as a statue of the Blue Lady be installed on it. The king, for the first time, denied that command, informed the captain that Huitzilopochtli was our first lord, and that to replace him was unthinkable. Captain Cortez had no alternative, and so he withdrew his demand, but not with politeness. He instead scowled and turned his back on the king, an insult so glaring, so unforgivable, that news of it made its way into every corner of our city. The word went out. The gods had chilled towards one another. Matters became worse when news reached Tenochtitlan that our warriors had killed a Captain Juan Escalante and 6 of his soldiers. We all rejoiced when we received that information, because that proved to everyone that those people were not gods but men who could be defeated. Soon after, knowing that he and his followers were in danger, Captain Cortez immediately gathered his captains, and together they approached Moctezuma. That encounter was the beginning of the end. From that moment on, everyone realized that war between the Mexicas and the whites was imminent. On that day, Moctezuma's wife and I conversing with him when Captain Cortez, Malinche, and his companions walked in the chamber, became unannounced. Cortez spoke in a stiff, controlled manner, giving us the impression that underneath those words was intense anger. Malinche translated. Majesty, I have cared and loved your person from the moment of our arrival. I have dealt with you in the full respect due to your honorable person, and I have done all in my power not to harm, hinder, or damage either your subjects or your city. I thought that you in turn would deal with me in like manner, but now I see that I have been deceived. You have acted dishonorably behind my back." The king was not shaken, but answered in a strong voice, "I do not know what you mean. If I or any one of my subjects had given you cause to say these things to me, be frank and speak directly to the meaning of your words. I have not deceived you, and your allegation that I have acted dishonorably offends me." "You know what I mean." The captain's voice rose in a pitch, and at that moment I overheard one of the soldiers mutter, "Dog!" Cortez spoke on, his face blanched, his lips glistening and trembling. "You know that Escalante and 6 of our men were murdered in a cowardly attack that took place under your orders. There is no way for you to pretend ignorance. Nothing in this land happens without your knowledge, Moctezuma." He pronounced the king's name with disdain. "Now we are here not to be told lies, but for you to take action to punish this crime committed against our king and our person." There was silence in the chamber because Moctezuma refused to respond to Cortez's demand. I looked at the king's wife, but she did not betray emotion. I looked at Moctezuma and saw that his face had also turned to stone. I alone felt my body trembling. Then the Spaniards withdrew to one side of the chamber and conferred secretly. Suddenly they rushed the king, surrounded him, and slapped shackles on his wrist. It happened so quickly, so unexpectedly, that his wife and I stood in stunned confusion. Moctezuma himself showed that he could not believe what was happening, and he stared at his wrists as if they were strange monsters. It all happened in a moment, but in the end Captain Cortez had transformed Moctezuma from king to prisoner. From there he was taken off to Cortez's chambers and kept there until the 4 warriors who had killed Escalante and his companions were brought to Tenochtitlan at the order of Hernan Cortez. Days after, when word spread through the city that the warriors were about to enter through the Serpent Wall, everyone abandoned what they were doing and ran out to the central square, hoping to capture a passing glimpse of those men who were by now heroes. They had demonstrated the courage to prove that invaders were not gods after all. They had exerted Mexican power and prevailed against the enemy. They had single-handedly done what everyone yearned to do to the foul-smelling, vile-sounding creatures whose presence we all found sickening. Those warriors were now more valuable to us than perhaps our gods, because they at least were there, flesh and blood, walking and smiling and hailing us, telling what we could do if only we had the boldness. By that time everyone knew of the imprisonment of Moctezuma, and knowing this threatened us more, because now we were without a leader. Nevertheless, those 4 Mexicans, even though held in shackles, gave us hope that somehow we would yet defeat Captain Cortez and his followers. The warriors marched in through the Serpent Wall, holding themselves erect. Thunder could not have drowned out the roar that rose from the crowd. Nothing could have diminished the booming of the sacrificial drums that beat and pounded out their joy. Even the firearms of the Spaniards could not have squelched the clamor created by thousands of rattles and the bleaching of conch shells. The whooping of the war cry shattered the air, tearing at the wind. Despite the warriors being bounded together by shackles, they were showered with gems, feathers, and flowers. Our people rushed them, pushing, thrusting, touching them, patting their shoulders, and kissing them. The Spaniards looked on in gloomy silence. We know that they were afraid. Cortez silenced the clamor by stepping into the center of the square, fists clenched and held arrogantly on his clips. He swiveled slowly in a full circle until satisfied that everyone in the crowd had seen his stony face. He turned to the prisoners, and in a voice that bounced off the temple walls, he addressed them. "Will you confess to the murder of Captain Escalante and his men?" Silence. Only the sound of wind slithering from altar to altar could be heard. "If you recant, I will pardon you." Again there was no response, and we looked on, knowing that those warriors would not do as commanded. When Cortez became convinced that they would say nothing, admit nothing, accuse no one, he gave the order. Burn them. Father Benito leaned back in the chair as he stared at the begonia plants. He didn't ask if the warriors had been executed because, although this incident had not been recorded nor studied in Spain, he knew enough of Captain Cortez to know that he would have indeed followed through with that punishment. Again the priest felt torn between what he felt was justice and the growing sympathy he felt for the Indian woman's people. Disturbed, he rubbed his eyes, wondering if he should put an end to the session. The prisoners marched to the center of the square. I was, as was my duty, accompanying the king's wife, who from the moment of his captivity hardly left his side. Then the sudden howl that went up from the crowd told us that something important was about to begin. I stepped out to the terrace and began a spectacle that I will never forget. In the center of the courtyard I saw 4 posts with bases packed with mounds of wood. I stood watching as the 4 warriors walked with dignity and without showing fear. When my eyes focused on one of them, I realized that it was Tetla, the man whom I had hated but who was now a hero of Mexican nation. I admit that I was shocked and that I tried to feel sympathy, but because I could not, I concentrated on him as he was bound to the stake with ropes. There my eyes remained until his last moment. The people shouted suddenly ceased, and silence engulfed us. One of the Christian priests, holding a book in his hands, muttered incantations, frequently lifted his right hand to cut the emptiness with the sign of the cross. His voice floated through the air of Tenochtitlan for all of us to hear. Do you reject the Prince of Darkness and accept the Prince of Light? Do you disdain your life of sin and take to your bosom the true God? Do you forsake the infernal realm of Satan and yearn for paradise? There was no response to the priest's questions, only silence. Do you reject your idols and embrace the loving kindness of He who is pure mercy? Do you reject your evil ways and solemnly promise to follow the ways of virtue? Do you repudiate the fiendish ways of your ancestors and take to your heart the chastening light of the cross? Again, nothing happened. Not a sound came from the warriors that awaited death. That was silence in the courtyard of Tenochtitlan. Only a cold, tired wind blew from the summits of the volcanoes. The priest looked around him, blinking, showing that he was baffled and that he did not know what to do. For a moment he turned toward the prisoners in a supplicating way. Then his body changed, stiffened, his face grew red, and in a loud voice he shouted, "Then I condemn you and your foul idiots to the bowels of hell, and to the eternal flames of Lucifer and his legion of demons, there to be purified and tortured for ages upon ages. Amen." Amen! The voices of the Spaniards echoed the word, but their expression sounded thin and uncertain. Then the fire was lighted at each of the men's feet. Señora, I witnessed such acts of purification when I was a boy, and I need not record such a description. Besides, Holy Mother Church has carefully chronicled these events, which are well known to our scholars. It brings nothing new. Huitzilin ignored Benito's words and went on speaking. The billows of smoke rose to the height of the great temple. The cackle of branches sputtered, and soon flames engulfed the bodies of the men. I could not remove my eyes from Tetla's body, that body that had abused my own, that had caused me pain and humiliation. I watched his face, and except for the twitching of the muscles around his lips, it was as calm as it had been upon the day of our wedding. Sweat began to pour from his face and the body as the tongues of fire licked first at his ankles and knees and thighs, then at his stomach and chest, then his neck, throat, and face. His hair caught fire and exploded into a mass of flames that danced upward, elongating him, giving him a height he had never possessed. Soon he was wrapped in blue and purple flames. I could no longer distinguish his body from the glare, and so what had been brown flesh was now a snarl of red and gold and black. Then Tetla began to dissolve. His flesh became liquid. It dripped unevenly, running off his body in globs. I saw his body quiver, but yet no sound came from his mouth. What had once been Tetla became smaller, shorter, reduced first to the shortness of a stalk of maize, then to the size of those dwarfs who entertained Moctezuma. then smaller still to the size of a low chair, until there remained only a head that soon became obscured by swirling ash and thick gray smoke. Tetlow was dead, and I am a witness that he never uttered a cry of pain. In Tenochtitlan silence reigned like an evil scourge after that execution, and if anyone listened carefully, all that could be heard was the weeping of Moctezuma, king of the once mighty Mexican nation.